In this video, we are going to talk about how we can efficiently represent information in graphs. So different types of graphs use different ways of representing information. Scatter plots use position, the relative location of the different points, whereas histograms and bar graphs use length, the relative heights of the bins or the bars in those graphs. But there are lots of other ways we can add information to a graph. We could use colors to distinguish between different categories of data. We could use different symbols to distinguish between different categories. And we could use things like area or angles to represent different quantities. Some of these can be added to the existing types of graphs we've already looked at to add extra variables to those graphs to show increasing amounts of covariation. In general, each extra aesthetic or type of encoding that you add to a graph means you can add one extra variable or column of your data frame to that graph. For example, a histogram shows a single continuous variable. We can add a second variable, a categorical variable, to that graph by adding color. In this case, we've mapped the categorical diagnosis column to the fill aesthetic. Fill means that it fills the inside of each bin with that color for each category of the variable. Well, there are two categories of diagnosis, either disease-free or heart disease. And the result is that the histogram is split into two different colors. Blue representing the counts of patients with heart disease and red representing the counts without heart disease. One thing to note is that because this is an aesthetic mapping, it does have to go inside the aesthetic function as a second argument after x. Unfortunately, the default style of a colored histogram is not super easy to interpret. The reason for this is that each color of bin will be stacked on the bins below it. So in other words, these red bins are stacked on top of the blue bins. The bottom of the red bin starts at the top of the blue bin. This means it's kind of hard when the heights of the two bins are similar to figure out which one is longer. Because you, the viewer, have to mentally reposition the red bin so that it starts at the same position as the blue bin, and the human brain is not very good at that. It's much easier for us to compare the relative heights of things if they both start at the same position, i.e. if all the bins were to start at the x-axis, like the blue bins are doing. So we can fix that, as you see here on the left, by adding two extra arguments to the geom function. Here we're specifying particular values, not creating aesthetic mappings, so these do not go inside the aesthetic function. They go as arguments to the geom function. First is this position argument, to which we're passing the value identity, a character string. What that does is it starts all of the bins at the x-axis. So you can see they're now overlapping. However, the default color is for the bins to be opaque. In other words, we can't see through them, which means that if the red bins behind the blue bins were shorter, then you wouldn't be able to see how tall the red bin is because it would be obscured by the blue bin. So we also need to make the bins transparent, which we do with the alpha argument. Alpha can be between 0, which is completely transparent, essentially invisible, all the way to 1, which is completely opaque, which is the default. Here we're setting it to 0.3, which is about sort of 30% transparent. The trouble with this is that where the colors overlap, they become this gray color, which is fine when we only have two colors. But once you start to add in more than two categories, it can be kind of hard to tell which sort of muddy overlapping gray corresponds to which of the original colors. An alternative is to create a graph called a frequency polygon, which is this line graph you see here on the right. And the way this is created is that the lines are drawn to join the tops of the bins of the histogram. So whereas a density plot was sort of an approximation, right, a rough line through the tops, a frequency polygon is an exact line, right, joining the top of each histogram exactly where it is. And this avoids the sort of overlapping gray color, and it means that if we had many categories, it would be much easier to see the line. We can also add color to bar graphs when we're plotting categorical variables. In this case, it means we can look at the covariation between two categorical variables, one on the x-axis and then one which we've mapped to the color, again using the fill argument because we want to color the inside of these shapes. Again, the default is to stack the bins on top of each other, which is not super helpful for the reasons we just talked about. So we could overlap the bins, but because the position on the x-axis of the bins doesn't matter too much in a bar graph, we can instead stick them side by side. For that, we say position equals dodge instead of identity. Now, one thing to note here is that some kinds of encodings are better than others. In other words, as humans, we can more easily interpret and compare them and get information from them. We mentioned before that we could use areas and angles to represent quantities instead of the aligned lengths that we've been looking at in histograms and bar graphs. However, it's much harder to compare the relative sizes of slices of a pie chart, like you see here on the left, than it is to compare the relative heights of bars in a bar graph. For example, right, we can see here that these two middle bars are relatively similar in height. They correspond to these two middle shades of blue in the pie chart. And it's much easier to tell in the bar graph that 3 is slightly higher than 2 and sort of get an accurate idea of by how much than it is to try and use the areas or angles from this pie chart. That's why it's very rare to see pie charts these days. With box plots and violins, we can actually add extra variables, extra categorical variables, directly into the graph itself. We can, and by doing so, we add extra boxes or extra violins to the graph. We can place this extra categorical variable on the y-axis or on the x-axis, depending on which orientation you want your boxes and violins to be in. With scatter plots, we can easily add color, as you see here, but instead of using the fill parameter, like we did with our graphs with big bars in, we're going to use the color argument. The reason for this is that ggplot distinguishes between color and fill. Color is kind of the outside of shapes, and fill is the inside of shapes. And for things like points and lines, we can only color the outside of them, essentially. There's no inner color for these types of shapes. In this case, we've supplied the color aesthetic mapping as a default inside the ggplot function, which means that it's applied to both the geom function creating the scatterplot layer and the geom smooth function creating the trend lines. The result is that both of these get split out into two separate colors. There are other ways we can add extra encodings to scatterplots. For example, we can customize the shape of points, which we've done here, splitting up into circles for disease-free observations and triangles for observations with heart disease. But it's much harder to distinguish between the two of them here than it was with color in the previous graph. They don't jump out at you in the same way. Similarly, we can use different styles of lines when we're creating lines. So we have a dashed line here representing the trend line through observations with heart disease, and a solid line with no dashes for disease-free patients. Again, it's also harder to distinguish between those than it was using color, as we saw in the previous slide.